The entry into Jerusalem. Bethany was about 3.5 kilometers from the temple, and around 1:30 that Sunday afternoon, Jesus prepared to depart for Jerusalem. He felt great affection for Bethany and the simple, sincere people who lived there. Nazareth, Capernaum, and Jerusalem had rejected him, but Bethany had accepted and believed in him. Jesus had carefully considered how he would enter Jerusalem. Up until now, he had always tried to suppress any public homage paid to him as the Messiah, but now things were different. There was no harm in allowing his followers to freely express their feelings. By surrounding himself with his followers, Jesus could enter Jerusalem freely, without fear of being arrested. When Jesus decided to enter Jerusalem openly, he still had to choose a method. Jesus reflected on the many somewhat contradictory so-called messianic prophecies, but there seemed to be only one that was somewhat fitting for this moment. Most of these prophetic statements described a warlike king, a successor of David, who would liberate all of Israel from the yoke of foreign domination. However, there was one passage in the scriptures that had been associated with the Messiah by those who leaned toward the spiritual view of his mission. And Jesus thought that this text could serve as a guide for his planned entry into Jerusalem. This text was found in Zechariah and read, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. He is righteous and brings salvation. He comes humble, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." A king on a warpath always entered a city on horseback. A king on a peace mission would typically enter riding on a donkey. Jesus did not want to enter Jerusalem as a man on horseback, but was willing to enter in peace and goodwill as the Son of Man on a donkey. Accordingly, right after the midday meal, Jesus called Peter and John to him. He said, "Go to Bethphage, and when you arrive at the crossroads, you will find a colt of a donkey tied up there. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks why you are taking the colt, just say, 'The master has need of it.'" When the two apostles went to Bethphage, they indeed found the colt, tied up next to its mother. As Peter began to untie the animal, the owner approached them and asked what they were doing. When Peter replied as Jesus had instructed, the man said, "If your master is Jesus of Galilee, he may have the colt." So they brought the donkey with them to Jesus. By this time, several hundred interested people had gathered around Jesus and his apostles, and soon word reached Jerusalem that something extraordinary was about to happen. As a result, many thousands of curious inhabitants and pilgrims poured out of the city to greet this much-talked-about prophet and miracle worker, whom some believed to be the Messiah. As the procession from Bethany set out, there was great enthusiasm among the festive people along the road. Among them were many of his disciples and believers, and from Jerusalem many inhabitants and pilgrims came out, many of whom were from Galilee and Perea. Before they set off, the twin sons of Alphaeus placed their cloaks over the donkey and held the animal steady so that Jesus could mount. The procession moved slowly and made its way to the top of the Mount of Olives. Meanwhile, the people along the road spread their clothes over the path and waved branches. Thus, a great honor guard was formed for the donkey, carrying the royal son, the promised Messiah. The procession moved toward Jerusalem with songs, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is the kingdom that descends from heaven." During the procession, Jesus was joyful and in good spirits until he reached the top of the Mount of Olives, where the city and the towers of the temple came into full view. There, the Master halted the procession, and a great silence fell over all when they suddenly saw him weeping. Jesus composed himself, and looking down at the multitude that had come out of the city to greet him, he said with a voice choked with tears, "O Jerusalem, If you only knew that this day could have been your day, a day when peace came to you, which you could have received so freely. But now these blessings will soon be hidden from your eyes. You are about to reject the Son of Peace and turn your back on the gospel of salvation. Soon the days will come upon you when your enemies will encircle you and besiege you on all sides. They will completely destroy you, leaving not one stone upon another. This will happen to you because you did not recognize the time of your divine visitation. You are about to reject the gift of God, and man will destroy you. After he had spoken, they began the descent of the Mount of Olives, and soon reached the multitude coming out of the city to meet them. They waved palm branches, sang hosannas, and in other ways expressed their joy and goodwill. As they approached Jerusalem, the crowd grew even more excited, so much so that some concerned Pharisees made their way to Jesus and begged him, "Teacher, you must rebuke your followers and urge them to behave more appropriately." Jesus replied, "It is entirely fitting that these children welcome the Son of Peace, who has been rejected by the chief priests. It would be useless to silence them, for if they were quiet, the stones here along the road would cry out in their place." In reality, this superficial, spontaneous outburst of enthusiasm among the people had no deep meaning. Although this welcome was joyful and sincerely meant, it did not represent any real or deep-rooted conviction in the hearts of this celebrating mass. These same people were willing to reject Jesus later that same week, when he was a helpless prisoner of the Sanhedrin, and they realized that Jesus was not going to establish the kingdom they had long expected. The whole city had entered a festive mood. When someone asked, "Who is this man?" people replied, "This is the prophet from Galilee, Jesus of Nazareth." Once they arrived at the temple, Jesus dismounted, and the twin sons of Alphaeus were instructed to return the donkey to its owner. Jesus and the 10 remaining apostles detached themselves from the crowd and walked onto the temple grounds. No attempt was made by the temple guards to arrest Jesus because they realized this would lead to public outrage. And this had been Jesus' strategy, by allowing the people to greet him, so he could now move safely within the city. Even the apostles had no idea that this was the only effective human method to prevent him from being immediately arrested upon entering the city. It was his desire to give the inhabitants of Jerusalem one last chance, as well as the tens of thousands of visitors to the Passover, to hear his gospel, and if they so wished, to accept the Son of Peace. Hundreds of people came to greet Jesus personally, and it was not until evening that the crowd dispersed. Jesus and his close followers were left alone. The apostles had much to think about. In all the years they had followed Jesus, they had never experienced such an honor. They sat down in the temple courtyard near the treasury and watched as people placed their offerings in it. The rich gave generously, and others according to their means. Finally, a poor widow arrived. She was poorly dressed, and they saw her holding 2 small copper coins in her old, withered hand, which she then dropped into the trumpet-shaped opening of the offering chest. Then Jesus drew the apostles' attention to the widow and said, "Take to heart what you have just seen. This poor woman has given more than all the others, for all the others have given out of their abundance. But this poor woman has, despite her own need, given all she had." Together they walked once more through the temple corridors, and after Jesus had absorbed these familiar scenes one last time, he involuntarily thought back to the first time he had engaged in debate with the rabbis as a young boy here. They decided to return to Bethany. Jesus went with Peter and John to the house of Simon, while the other apostles spent the night with various friends in Bethany and Bethphage.